By the late 1970s, industrial formulas were adopted as food ingredients. They blended into common household products. Their long-term effects on health were not immediately visible. This was not an isolated shift. What replaced older methods didn't feel like replacement. It felt like improvement. Faster production, longer shelf life, lower costs. These were presented as solutions to real problems, and in many ways they were. But what was lost in that exchange was never weighed publicly. The trade-offs were made by people who would never eat the results at scale. The language used to describe these changes was functional, not cautionary. Refined, fortified, enhanced. These words appeared on packaging with the weight of science behind them. They sounded like progress, and for a long time, that's exactly how they were received. The transition began decades earlier, but it accelerated after World War II. Industrial capacity that had been built for wartime production needed peacetime purpose. Food manufacturing absorbed much of that infrastructure. Factories that had produced rations began producing groceries. The logic of efficiency, of uniformity, of shelf-stable distribution, it all transferred directly. At first, this seemed unambiguously good. Food became more accessible. Prices dropped. Families who had struggled to afford variety now had options. Convenience was no longer a luxury. It was democratic. And that narrative held for years. But the methods required to achieve that convenience were rarely discussed in detail. Ingredients were broken down into components. Fats were separated, hydrogenated, recombined. Sugars were concentrated and chemically altered to behave in ways natural sugars wouldn't. Grains were stripped and reassembled. The goal was consistency. A product made in one facility should taste identical to the same product made 1,000 miles away. That required control, and control required transformation. Most people didn't question it. Why would they? The food looked familiar. It tasted fine. It was cheaper than what came before. And importantly, it came with the endorsement of institutions people trusted. Government agencies approved it. Doctors didn't raise alarms. Nutritionists, when they spoke at all, focused on vitamins and calories, not on the structural changes happening at the molecular level. It blended into everyday life. A generation grew up eating these products without knowing there had ever been an alternative. To them, this was just food. The idea that it had been fundamentally redesigned was not part of the conversation. There was no reason for it to be. Most people never noticed this at the time. The changes were incremental. A substitution here, a reformulation there. The overall experience of eating remained familiar enough that discontinuity was invisible. You could walk into a grocery store in 1985 and recognize almost everything. But the contents had shifted. What looked like butter often wasn't. What tasted like sugar often wasn't. What felt like bread had been structurally altered in ways that would have been unrecognizable to bakers from 2 generations prior. This wasn't discussed openly, not because it was hidden exactly, but because it wasn't considered noteworthy. The assumption was that if something was approved for sale, it had been adequately tested. And in a narrow sense, that was true. Acute toxicity was assessed. Immediate harm was ruled out. But long-term effects, especially at population scale, were largely theoretical. The data didn't exist yet. It couldn't. The products were too new. So, the rollout continued. New ingredients were introduced. New processes were adopted. And the marketplace responded with enthusiasm. Consumers bought what was available. What was available was what could be produced efficiently. And efficiency favored certain kinds of ingredients over others. Oils that had been used for generations were replaced with cheaper alternatives. Butter gave way to margarine. Lard gave way to vegetable shortening. These substitutions were framed as health improvements. Saturated fat was the enemy. Polyunsaturated fat was the solution. That message was broadcast widely. It was repeated in schools, in clinics, in government pamphlets, and it was wrong. Or at least, it was incomplete in ways that mattered. But at the time, the science seemed settled. Experts agreed, industry complied, and the public, trusting both, adjusted their behavior accordingly. They bought what they were told was better. They fed it to their children. They believed they were making responsible choices. The real impact appeared years later, not immediately, not in ways that could be traced cleanly back to a single cause. That's part of what made it so difficult to identify. Chronic conditions don't announce themselves the way acute poisoning does. They accumulate, they overlap, they interact with other variables, genetics, lifestyle, environment, in ways that obscure clear attribution. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. An entire food system had been built around these ingredients. Supply chains depended on them. Recipes assumed them. Replacing them would require not just individual choice, but structural overhaul. And there was no incentive for that. The people making decisions were not the people experiencing the outcomes. What changed wasn't just the food itself, but the relationship people had with eating. Meals that had once required preparation now required only reheating. Cooking skills that had been passed down through generations became optional. Convenience eclipsed ritual. And with that shift came a kind of detachment. Food became fuel, not culture. It became a product, not a practice. This wasn't accidental. It was the logical endpoint of industrialization. The same forces that had transformed manufacturing, agriculture, and labor were now transforming diet. And the effects were predictable if you looked at the pattern. Consolidation, simplification, optimization for profit, not for health. But none of this was framed as a problem at the time. It was framed as modernity, as liberation from the drudgery of the kitchen, as scientific advancement. And in some ways it was all of those things, but it was also something else, something that wouldn't become clear until much later. The system that emerged was not designed with malice, it was designed with incentives. Companies responded to what the market rewarded. The market rewarded shelf stability, low cost, and familiar taste. Those three variables shaped everything. They determined which ingredients were used, which processes were adopted, which products survived and which didn't. Health was a consideration, but it was secondary. It had to be. A product that was nutritionally optimal but spoiled quickly or cost too much would fail. So compromises were made, and those compromises accumulated. Regulatory agencies were involved, but their role was reactive, not proactive. They responded to concerns after products were already in circulation. They set thresholds for acceptable risk. But acceptable risk is not the same as no risk. And thresholds are population averages. They don't account for individual variability. They don't account for cumulative exposure. They don't account for interactions between multiple novel ingredients consumed simultaneously over decades. The people designing these systems were not negligent. They were working within constraints. They were optimizing for what they were asked to optimize for. But what they were asked to optimize for was not human thriving. It was market efficiency. And those are not the same thing. So decisions were made. Ingredients were substituted. Processes were streamlined. And the result was a food supply that looked abundant but was in many ways impoverished. Not in calories, in almost everything else. What most people ate by the 1990s bore little resemblance to what their grandparents had eaten, even when it carried the same name. Bread was still bread, cheese was still cheese, but the composition had changed. The flour was different, the fat was different, the preservatives were different. And those differences mattered. But they mattered slowly, in ways that didn't generate headlines, in ways that were difficult to measure. How do you quantify the long-term effect of eating hydrogenated oils every day for 30 years? How do you separate that from sedentary lifestyles, from stress, from environmental pollutants, from genetic predisposition? You can't. Not cleanly. So the uncertainty persists. And in that uncertainty, the system continues. Because it would be expensive. It would be disruptive. It would require admitting that mistakes were made. Not intentional harm, but mistakes nonetheless. And institutions are not built to admit that easily. Especially when the people who would benefit from change are diffuse and unorganized, and the people who would lose from change are concentrated and powerful. This dynamic is not unique to food. It's the same dynamic that governs environmental policy, labor law, financial regulation. The costs are socialized, the profits are privatized, and the people bearing the costs are told that this is simply how things work, that the alternatives are impractical, that the system, for all its flaws, is the best available option. And maybe that's true, or maybe it's just the option that serves the people with the most influence over what options are considered. What happened to food was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader transformation. The same principles that reshaped diet, reshaped medicine, education, entertainment, work. Efficiency over experience, scalability over sustainability, short-term metrics over long-term outcomes. And in each case, the changes were introduced gradually, with reassurances, with the weight of expertise behind them, with the promise that this was progress, not regression. And in each case, the people most affected were the last to be consulted. This wasn't unique to any one country, though the American model was particularly influential. It was exported, adopted, adapted, and now it's nearly universal. The same brands appear in grocery stores across continents, the same ingredients, the same processes, the same trade-offs. What was local became global. What was seasonal became year-round. What was scarce became abundant, and what was nourishing became optional. The people who grew up in this system had no reference point for what came before. To them, this was normal. This was food. The idea that it had been different, that it could be different, required either direct experience or deliberate education, and neither was widely available. Schools taught nutrition, but it was the nutrition of the system. Food pyramids built on the assumption that the food being consumed was fundamentally sound, that the issue was proportion, not composition, that if you ate the recommended servings, you would be healthy. And for some people, that was true, but for many, it wasn't. Because the baseline had shifted. What was considered normal intake of sugar, of processed oils, of chemical additives, it would have been unthinkable 2 generations earlier, but it was normal now. And normal is powerful. It shapes perception, it shapes behavior, it shapes policy. When something becomes normal, questioning it feels unreasonable, even when the evidence accumulates, even when the patterns become undeniable. The inertia of normalcy is immense. It takes extraordinary effort to overcome, and most people don't have that effort to spare. They're busy, they're tired. They trust that someone, somewhere, is ensuring that what's available is safe. And in a narrow sense, someone is. But safety is not the same as optimal. It's not even the same as good. It's just not immediately harmful. And that bar, low as it is, has been the standard. By the time researchers began identifying correlations between diet and chronic disease, the system was entrenched. Changing it would mean challenging industries worth billions. It would mean revising decades of public health guidance. It would mean acknowledging that the experts had been, if not wrong, then at least incomplete in their understanding. And that acknowledgement has been slow, partial, reluctant, because the stakes are high, not just economically, but epistemically. If the foundations of nutritional science over the past half-century were flawed, what else might be? What other accepted truths might be built on incomplete data, on assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time but weren't? Those questions are uncomfortable. They destabilize certainty, and certainty is what institutions rely on to maintain authority. So the revisions happen quietly. Guidelines are updated, recommendations are softened, but the underlying framework remains largely intact. Meanwhile, people continue eating what's available, because that's what people do. They work with what they have. They trust the systems they're embedded in. They assume that if something were truly dangerous, it wouldn't be sold. And that assumption, reasonable as it sounds, has been proven wrong repeatedly throughout history. But each time, the lesson is the same. The harm is diffused, the responsibility is unclear, the correction is slow, and by the time it arrives, a new set of problems has already emerged. What replaced real food didn't arrive overnight. It arrived through a series of decisions, each one rational in isolation, each one responding to immediate pressures: lower costs, longer shelf life, greater consistency. These were not trivial concerns. They were real. They mattered. But they weren't the only things that mattered. And in prioritizing them, other things were deprioritized. Nutrient density, digestibility, the ecological impact of monoculture farming required to produce key ingredients at scale, the social impact of eroding food culture and cooking knowledge. Those costs were externalized, pushed onto individuals, onto communities, onto future generations. And now, those costs are coming due. Not all at once, not in ways that are easy to quantify, but they're there. In chronic illness rates, in healthcare expenditures, in the quiet erosion of vitality that has become so common it's almost invisible. And this wasn't the only change. Similar decisions followed in medicine, in agriculture, in urban planning, each one optimized for a specific set of variables, each one creating unintended consequences that wouldn't be understood for years. That pattern didn't stop there.